Welcome everyone to our latest weekly meeting of the Connecting for Work and Learning initiatives for ShapingEDU. It's a broadband initiative where our goal is to do everything we can to help people connect across the United States with universal broadband for work and learning. We've been meeting every week for a couple of years now. One of our great colleagues, H. Trossel, has been focusing on the tremendous area of working in Indian country to do broadband work there. There's some magnificent reports. We featured H on our blog about 6 or 7 months ago, talking about some of the work that they're doing. And today we're going to center our whole conversation around H giving us an update and leaving us some room during the session for a lot of Q&A with a goal of seeing what we can do next to take concrete steps toward universal broadband, especially with that important constituency in place. So H, take it away. Glad to have you here featured rather than just being a participant in the usual conversations.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm H. Many of you know me. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation and I work at the American Indian Policy Institute here at ASU. And I have been working on tribal broadband issues for like the past 7 years. So to kind of put this discussion in perspective, and I do want this to be a discussion. I don't want to just be yelling statistics at you. Back in 2010, when the FCC did their national broadband plan, it was estimated that only about 10% of tribal lands had broadband access. Now that statistic isn't directly comparable to today because of the many different ways that the federal government calculates what is considered tribal lands or not, but it's sort of a baseline. And today, the estimate is that about 79% of tribal lands, of all tribal lands, that includes Alaska and Hawaii, actually have broadband access. So this has been a huge increase. There have been a number of federal programs along the way between 2010 and now 2022 that have led to this increase. But there's still a lot to be done. There was a recent report that the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis released that found that even with this increased broadband deployment, we are still seeing a lack of broadband adoption on tribal lands. In fact, if you imagine reservations and then you imagine the areas immediately adjacent to reservations, those non-tribal areas, they found that the tribal areas had 21 percentage points lower broadband adoption than those that were immediately non-tribal, immediately next to the reservation. So it's not just a matter of infrastructure, it's also a matter of getting users online and comfortable with this technology. And we have talked about that a little bit at ShapingEDU with several of the projects that we've been putting together. Now, the other sort of update I have is that the federal government has finally created a fund specific for tribal broadband deployment. It's the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. It only is funded about $3 billion, but the need is at least $5 billion and possibly more now because of inflation. And the federal government is slowly approving all of the applications that have been submitted for that $3 billion worth of funding. Now, there is sort of a small problem with distributing all of this funding. The way that the rules are structured, every tribe that applies gets at least 500,000, but they want their whole project to be funded. And will they only be able to get partial funding? Will they have to combine it with other funds from like USDA, because USDA has a lot of rural broadband funding available as well. So it's a very interesting moment right now in tribal broadband as we are all trying to navigate this and figure out the best ways to go forward. At the same time, there are programs out there that are trying to increase capacity building within Indian country to make sure that tribes have the ability to build their own networks if they so choose, in order to sort of decrease some of those costs associated with their projects. So one of them that I went to the initial meeting for initial kickoff last summer is called Tribal Broadband Boot Camp, and it is run by Matt Rantanen out of Southern California. He works for Tribal Digital Village. He's actually on the board at the American Indian Policy Institute here. And what it does is it teaches tribal employees, usually within IT departments, but also within other departments. I know we had some folks at the first kickoff from like Fish and Wildlife. But it teaches them how to build a wireless network, what the very basics of the technology are, what things you might need to outsource and find a consulting company to help you with versus what things you can do in-house. And they have continued to do several of these boot camps, and they just got funding to do at least 5 more, I believe, over the next year. And it is a really unique opportunity to see how networks can be built and how they can be adapted for the particular terrain of each reservation. Because Southern California, very deserty, but some of the tribes that had come down to learn about the program were actually from Pacific Northwest, so a lot more trees. And so what does that do for wireless infrastructure? So there is a lot of continued learning that happens at the boot camp and after the boot camp, as everyone remains connected through various social media platforms. Additionally, another update of what is going on right now in the tribal broadband space is that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance is working with Amarin Risk to distribute funding for digital navigators. And so this is, again, when I'm talking about increasing broadband adoption in Indian country. It's not just enough to bring the infrastructure in, you have to get people on board with signing up, subscribing to the network, and using it regularly. So Amarin has a coordinator on staff named Davida, who lives in the Phoenix region, who is helping coordinate distributing all these funds and setting up these digital navigators across reservations in the US. And then we also have a lot of information coming out about the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is giving money to the states, but it really does encourage states to work with tribes. And so we were thinking that that is a potential funding source for meeting some of those shortfalls that we're going to see with the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. So it's just a matter of coordinating all of this funding. I was recently up at the National Congress of American Indians, where I presented specific resolutions in my individual capacity as a member of NCAI. But one of them was specifically about removing some of the barriers that have been identified in this BEAD program. There are things about letters of credit and other sorts of financial and like legal requirements that we've seen with past USDA programs that haven't really worked well for tribal lands. And so we're making sure to ask NTIA, the agency that is heading the BEAD program, for waivers and for clarification as much as possible. I don't believe NCI has published these resolutions yet, but when they do, I will post them to the ShapingEDU Slack and such. Trying to think of other sort of big updates. Are there things that y'all wish you knew about tribal broadband that I can like answer for you right now?
What I'd love to do is jump in at a very human level. That report that you shared with me a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly, it had 5 case studies, and it was a magnificent example of individuals working together to collaborate, to bring together different agencies. What I'd love you to do, if you can do it off the top of your head, is choose one of those case studies, outline what the starting point was, what came out of it, and the individuals, the actions they took to get that there. Let's inspire other activists out there and show them this is not an impossible thing.
Definitely. Stacy, did you have a question as well before I jump into that?
I do, but it's not time pressing, so let's go with Paul's, and then I do have a question. I'll just leave my hand up so we don't forget.
Okay. The report that Paul mentioned is available at the ILSR website. Let me grab the link for it real quick. It does outline, 5 case studies, and I've spoken with several women behind these networks many times, and I'm always impressed with what they have to say. One that really strikes me is Mohawk Networks. So that is located up between New York and Quebec. So it's split across the US-Canadian border. And so when they were trying to figure out solutions that would work for their community, they had to consider like international complications as well as just navigating state and federal jurisdiction. What they ended up doing was, after years and years of work, pulling together funding from the USDA to fund a fiber network on the US side of their town, Akwesasne. And from that, they were able to put up wireless towers connected to that fiber that they had spread all throughout the town. And using wireless towers, they were able to connect everyone on the Canadian side. So it was a little bit of like managing licenses for spectrum, but it ended up proving pretty doable. And at the same time as they were applying for all of these grants and such to get things going, they also started expanding access to computers within their communities. So they put a lot more computers within the Boys and Girls Club in order to get younger people, especially online, as they built out this network. I will say that, let me see what the statistics are, because I have them written down right over here. Yep, so their network does a minimum of 25 megabits per second, which is broadband. And at the time that this was written, this was 2020. The cost was about $60, but there are lots of federal programs to help reduce that cost. And the network reaches 1,500 households total, which is pretty much everyone within the area. And they used $10 million for the fiber project from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So that was 2012. And they finished building it in 2015. And they used an additional $5 million from the tribe itself to fund the network, especially the wireless expansion. And when I was talking to Mitchell, she's the general manager there. She really highlighted the importance of building these networks with financial stability in mind, and making sure that when you're accepting federal dollars, having someone who has experience managing grants before, as well as like managing all of the paperwork that goes along with federal dollars, because it's not quite as easy as like private foundation grants. And so she just, she'd been working for a really long time in her community to get this going. And she's always awesome to speak to about this. It's the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, and it's Mohawk Networks.
You know, I want to jump in and make a couple points here that they tend to get lost if we just look at stats. That is the thing you just said. She worked at this for a really long time. And the thing that you said in our earlier conversations as well as today, that this was a kind of effort where you looked at all kinds of opportunities rather than just going for any one thing. And you had enough people that were always looking for other opportunities. If this chunk of money didn't exist here, you look for something else. And people were very flexible and very adaptable in the situations to get where they wanted to go. What would you suggest to people that are jumping into a process like this and thinking, oh, we'll get broadband in a year because there's all this money floating around and then it's done? What's the reality of this and the encouragement you can offer?
The reality is it's definitely going to take a little more than a year to get all of the funding lined up. Like for instance, the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program funding that has been lined up for a year now, and it's not out yet. So communities still don't have broadband, but it is on its way. Like once you have a good structure within your community for how to handle the financial side of it and how to act quickly once that money comes in, because there's often deadlines associated around spending the money as soon as you get it. So you have to have everything lined up ahead of time. You have to have contractors mostly picked out. You can't be waiting around. But it's not impossible. And especially with some of the wireless solutions, it's very quick to put up a usable system that can at least get connectivity to like the community center while you figure out the rest of the sort of build out of your community.
It is so refreshing at a time when everybody's talking about how impossible it is to accomplish anything, to hear you say it's not impossible. Those are words we just have to hang on our hats and keep reminding people as we try to do what you're doing and what so many other people are doing, that with community and with the dedication and the commitment to stay with it for the years and years it can sometimes take, that magnificent results are possible.
Definitely. Stacy, what was your question?
I'm going to tag on to what Paul just said real quick and say that I think, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but people see things that aren't immediate as impossible. And there's a very big difference. Like a lot of things are possible if we're willing to put time into doing the work to get there. Everybody froze, so I'm assuming that was me. Did you hear what I said?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was like, wow, I must be really saying something profound because everybody's staring at me with the same exact look. And then I realized, no, that was my internet. So I liked what Paul said, because people do see if it's not immediate, then it's impossible, but things are possible, but they take work. And I think sometimes that gets lost on people. The question I had, H, and this is something that it may be my naivety, and which is why I'm really happy that you're here and can help. But one of the things that I am 100% behind broadband for everybody, but one of the things that I'm constantly aware of in the back of my mind is, going back to the Crusades, they said, well, if we just make everybody Christian, we'll solve all the world's problems, but maybe that wasn't a really good idea. When somebody passes away, everybody shows up with a hash brown casserole. Okay, we can only take so many hash brown casseroles. Thank you for your kindness. And then more recently, the tribe that was discovered in South America that has never seen people outside of their tribe and doesn't know that electricity exists and things like that. And they're trying to protect them and allow them to have that culture and still remain that way. Is there a place, like, I don't know, like you were talking about, the lack of connectivity in tribal lands compared to lands immediately adjacent to them. And I've driven through some tribal lands in Montana and the Dakotas before, and it was mind-boggling to me how much different the land immediately outside the tribal land was versus the expanse of the tribal land that we were fortunate enough to be able to drive through. Is there anything in the culture or in that makes them, do they feel like we're pushing hash brown casseroles at them, or Christianity on the Crusades? Like, is this, are we violating people's belief systems by doing anything like that? And it may be me being naive, but it's always something I'm worried about, because just because I think it's a good idea doesn't mean somebody buys into that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are a bunch of different views within tribes. And there are certainly some lands where you probably do not ever actually want internet access, particularly like sacred sites. Maybe not having everyone on their phone there is a good idea. But we've also heard a lot from tribal leaders throughout this pandemic about how important having broadband is for their communities, how they are very concerned about the access to healthcare. And they're seeing telemedicine as a really good option for their communities who are very remote and have to drive really far to be able to see a nurse or a doctor. Additionally, we've also seen how tribes have used internet access to sort of boost their cultural and language engagement. When I was at the Indigenous Connectivity Summit that is put on by the Internet Society every year, there are always stories about how once a community had internet access, how they set up these Facebook marketplaces, which were pretty much exclusive for people within the community to be able to buy and sell cultural goods more easily. And they didn't have to necessarily leave their homes and set up shop for a while. They could just handle it all from their homes. And a lot of people did that, and it caused more interest in traditional arts and crafts. So yes, every community should really have a plan for when they bring broadband and cell phone access to their community. Mark out the spots where they don't actually want it, and all of the areas that are key to have it, such as schools and libraries and areas that you could set up as like community care clinics for accessing telemedicine. Because for some people, it might not be doable to, for some communities, it might not be doable to have telemedicine from their home. It might be easier to have it at a more centralized location with better internet connection, maybe a registered nurse available to answer questions, and then to Zoom or Skype in the doctor to actually do sort of the telemedicine exam. We've seen that as really popular in rural areas as well.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, H. So to show my ignorance about Indian country, there are within Indian country, there are different communities within a tribe. And so how are people applying for funds? And it relates to the question, to the comment you made earlier about the need for people to have broadband plans. And so how are they applying for funds today? How are they doing about, like here in Arizona, where we have broadband action teams in communities that have come together, created plans, written grants, and so forth. So how is that? I mean, I'm sure it's different everywhere, but generally, how are people applying for funds, chapter houses, libraries, the tribe as a whole? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right, Arizona is very different, especially Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation is split into chapters for folks who don't know. And those chapters are sort of, they're sort of like small towns, but not really. And because Navajo Nation is so big, what Navajo Nation has done is allowed each of the chapters to create their own broadband plans and apply for funds themselves. Now, I'm not sure if they did that specifically through the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program or if they applied as Navajo Nation and will distribute those funds separately. But I do know that having each chapter be somewhat autonomous in this process is more of the plan going forward for the BEAD program. In order to get plans that are more localized, because Navajo Nation is just so big. Other tribes like the Ojibwe tribes here in Minnesota, there is like one federally recognized like Ojibwe tribe that is actually made up of multiple bands, which are all have their own separate reservations. And each of those bands has applied separately for the broadband funding. And they may have applied for a Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, or they may have applied for some of the USDA funds. But oftentimes what you'll find is the development of some sort of plan first before applying for the funds, just because a lot of the federal grant processes are so specific as to where exactly are you bringing this broadband, that people want a formalized plan before they submit their project. Now, there are also tribes in California that are one tribe but have multiple reservations. And I believe those ones are submitting as a single tribe and like will disperse the funds throughout their particular reservations. So it varies so much across Indian country. And Arizona is a very specific and interesting case. So especially as this BEAD program goes forward, I would expect to see more emphasis from the particular chapters, especially in areas of the state that are most likely to get this funding.
So how are they writing the grants? They have people within their entities who have expertise in being able to do the planning and grant writing and actually managing the grants. Are they hiring consultants? Are they drawing upon IT people at the tribal level? Do you have any comments about that? Because it's not easy to write those grants.
No, it's not. And it's a mix. Each tribe is doing it slightly differently. I know several tribes are working with consulting firms. I spoke with some planners and consultants while I was at National Congress of American Indians. I also have seen like several of the tribes detailed in that report that Paul brought up. They actually wrote those grants internally using existing people in their IT and legal departments. So because there's so much money going around and there's so much more opportunity, I'm seeing more and more that people are using consultants.
Thank you.
But there's no guarantee that the particular community you're thinking of is going to be using a consultant.
H, we're far from finished with this conversation, but I want to start seeding it with actions. One thing that strikes me is when we finish with this recording, it should be a fairly easy thing for us to get this posted and start promoting this as a resource for people that are curious about how this goes. Stephanie, what's the possibility of actually getting this on the ShapingEDU YouTube channel within the next week or so?
Fantastic. We can definitely do that.
Good. So let me suggest that if we can get that up, let us know as soon as it's up. And I would encourage everybody who's part of this to share that out over your social media networks and anywhere else that you've got direct contact with people. Say, we just had this magnificent session with H, and we talked about community and flexibility and a little bit about grant writing, what goes into that, the determination, the long-term nature of this. This is in a nutshell, a lot of things that people are struggling with, and it could be a great form of encouragement. So I would encourage all of us as step one, as soon as this is up, put it out there and keep referring back to this as a resource. It's very helpful to others. I also wanted to get a little more interaction going with other people here between them and H. What are the questions you have for H, and what other actions might we recommend out of this conversation that we're having today?
Yeah, several of the sort of actions are continuing to share, American Indian Policy Institute's research. We have a portal on our website that links to all of the tribal broadband funding opportunities available. It breaks it down by if you're federally recognized tribe or state recognized, or if you are a tribally owned ISP, what funding is actually available. Additionally, following the resources put out by the National Congress of American Indians, and amplifying the voices of Native broadband activists as you see them. There are not that many of us out there, but we are pretty vocal. Additionally, if you have experience with grant writing or financial management or whatever, being willing to share that expertise is always helpful. Those are some of the big ways to be involved right now. I see Barnaby has his hand up.
Sorry, let me unmute and lower my hand. H, this is wonderful, absolutely so wonderful. You had mentioned the Department of Agriculture, USDA. They definitely have a mandate to help support and provide engagement for rural America. I was intrigued because a couple things. One, their definition of high broadband is slightly different than everyone else's, and how that has been squaring with your own efforts or that of other native broadband activists in bringing them to parity. And the second is how seamless is that relationship between USDA, which is always seen as immediately as supporting farms and ranches, not necessarily other dimensions of rural America. So that's the one. And then the other that I'm and you started hitting it just right now. What can we do for intersectional capacity, help further amplify and augment that? I think there's an immediacy there of ASU in particular, but there's so many others that have built-in grant writers and financial management capacity that there's an opportunity there to further extend that and elevate and serve in conjunction with you and others, those unmet communities. But again, USDA, and what can we do to help further support you?
Question.
I see you, Arlie.
Thank you, H, and for your presentation. Barnaby, the U.S. and everyone, the USDA has been supporting rural broadband since the 1990s.
Yeah.
The catch in their grant applications, and H, this is a question to you, and why I was always somewhat hesitant about this program, is that they do not provide any staff support. It is purely an equipment-oriented grant application. So you can get equipment, but you can't hire your staff. And so it's a catch-22, and you have to have funding sources or operational budget allocations in order to really capitalize on what the USDA offers. And no matter what we've said to them, and they have wonderful people nationwide, they have regional people who work with you and will help you, you still have to provide a major component of grant requests for broadband. Is that still true, H? I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that is still true. I know that other programs like the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program actually put money aside specifically for helping fund planning and some of the more, soft and squishy non-equipment and capital cost needs of these networks, because that has been a huge thing that tribes have been advocating for, is getting funding that they can actually use. Like in a lot of the case studies in that report, for instance, the ones with like Mohawk Networks and Onion Fiber Services, the tribes do have to put up quite a bit of money up front to cover those staff costs. And I think one of them was really interesting. I don't remember which one it was, but they ended up partnering with their tribal casino to handle a lot of the financial management, because they were like, we already have people on staff who are tribally employed who know how numbers work. So, you see some interesting things along those lines. We've also seen, and like Barnaby was saying, USDA really, you associate with farms, you associate with ranches, but they've been, like Arlene said, been involved in broadband expansion for 30 some years. And one of the things that we've also seen is a growing interest in like the telephone and electric co-ops that have been supported by USDA, using USDA funds and working with tribes, because they're often in very similar areas. We've also seen some tribes go after a particular federal funding called the Universal Service Fund that is through sort of through the Federal Communications Commission, technically through USAC, but it requires a particular designation called like eligible telecommunications carriers, and there's not very many of them. It's really hard to get that designation, but that can provide subsidies for telephone and for increasing broadband access. So there is a lot of interest by tribes in exploring alternate ways of getting funding available.
Just a second for anybody watching the archive version of this. Mark is actually putting some wonderful resources in the chat. I want to call attention to those. They're primarily from a group called the Benton Institute and the Blanding Foundation. And his note here for anybody that's not in the session and looking at it later, the Benton Institute and Blanding Foundation published, quote, Accelerate, a community broadband planning program in June 2022. There's a background article at benton.org. There's a whole long URL there, but if you get to benton.org, that should lead you toward that. And he also says there's a PDF download at benton.org that can get you there. I just brought that up on my own screen. It looks like a wonderful, wonderful resource. So for those of you watching the archive version, for those of us talking about next steps, remember, we have these great resources. And whether we have time to read all the way through them or just skim them and share them with people, we're not starting from scratch at all on this issue. And as Arlene and H and others have said over and over again, people have been working the issue for a long, long time. And what's making it happen, making it change for the positive, is that we're taking the baby steps to get us to the larger goal of universal broadband access throughout the United States. We need you. If you're interested in this, come to our Tuesday meetings, contact Lisa Gustinelli or me or Stephanie through ShapingEDU. We'll get you in here, because the more the merrier, and the more people we have, the better opportunity we have of making the difference that we're trying to make here. H, anything you want to add to that in terms of other resources people might look at?
I think people should also get involved with their like local philanthropy organizations. Philanthropy Northwest has a tribal broadband learning group like every month. Additionally, I know that Indian Fiber Services, one of the case studies in Minnesota, they use funding from the Blandon Foundation to do a lot of their initial planning and getting feedback from their community in order to make sure that they were building the kind of broadband network that was actually going to meet community needs. So there's a lot of opportunity to get involved.
And I would just throw, we always say this at these meetings, H, so many of these people that you're mentioning. If you want to draw them into the conversation, have them come in to do what you did today to carry this further. It should not be a one shot. It should be an ongoing conversation where it builds and builds and builds until we see the changes we want to make. So please don't hesitate to let Lisa or me know if you've got somebody that we can schedule in for another one of these sessions to have the conversation, to record it, and through that recording, disseminate it through our own network and through the networks of the people that we know and love.
And Paul, I just wanted to make sure that Lisa Gustinelli's question was addressed that she put into chat. Do the tribes have digital navigators that are assigned to help the tribal members make the most of the broadband connection once they have it?
Some communities, yes, some communities, no. That's part of what NDIA and Amaranth are trying to expand, is to make sure that as communities get connected, that they have digital navigators who can help, especially for getting people signed up for the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, because that is a huge boost on tribal lands. It's still a $75 discount. So some of those numbers that I was reading off earlier about, their base broadband speed is $60. Well, if you have ACP, then that is free. So, it works pretty well.
Stephanie and Stacy, I have not been monitoring the chat as closely as I should be because I'm trying to pay attention to what H is saying and not lose a thread of the conversation here. Are there other unanswered questions from chat that we should be bringing out to the forefront now?
There's no unanswered questions, just a couple of other good resources from John that I've copied down too. So,
and we can put those in the YouTube channel, the text below the video, so we can have those available in that space as well.
That's wonderful.
And I'll remind people again that you can download the chat. And so you can have all those contacts, all of the information, all the links. If you put a file in there, then you can't download it if you download the chat, but you can while the meeting's still going on.
Thank you, Steve. H, if you could dream of one action that would come out of today's conversation, what might that action be?
I think the biggest thing is just amplifying the current resources that we have and highlighting how we need to take action now, especially to get all of this federal funding out to actually fund these projects. Barnaby asked about other foundations predisposed to supporting tribal nations. Yeah, there's quite a few. Blandon is the one that I know here in Minnesota that does a lot of work around broadband and not just with tribes. But pretty much any foundation that includes a rural service area is interested in broadband in some capacity. Oftentimes they don't know what all they can do until you approach them and suggest a project. You also had asked or mentioned E-rate, which reminded me of an actual really big thing that happened in tribal broadband that kind of got like hidden under all the funding opportunities. It used to be that tribal libraries were not all eligible for E-rate funding, but that was recently changed. Mm-hmm. So now tribes can designate tribal libraries, and those tribal libraries will be eligible to get this E-rate funding, which allows you to pay for a broadband connection or even build a broadband connection out to the library and the community.
Great. We're nearing the end of our hour together. Does anyone else have questions or suggested actions that we want to incorporate into the conversation we're having today?
No.
Arlene?
I have something different, but could be helpful for H and tribal. I wanted to show off my internet safety guide. And we developed this primarily for seniors. It has lots of visuals and really creates ways to help people learn how to protect themselves from phishing and hacking and scams and fraud and disinformation and misinformation. And we have it in English and in Spanish. I'm very proud of these.
Thank you.
I
You
work
should
with
be.
2 young Latinx women, teaching them how to create curriculum, to test it, proofread it, test it again, and then reproduce it. And of course, I wrote it into grants so we can put these copies in libraries and at PTA meetings, etc. But I'd love to, for the group, for our immediate core group, and maybe for our resources, share this. And H, I think it's so visual. It is done so beautifully visually to make it very understandable. It's just bullet points and photographs and what to look at, and to make sure websites are secure by seeing the locks, etc. So this is hot off the press.
If you can
So how do we get
somehow
it up
send a
to
copy
stores?
to Stephanie, Stacy, Lisa, and me, we'll make sure that we get it out to the group and see what else we can do to disseminate it. That's wonderful. For anybody watching the
Okay.
archive version, hope it's obvious to you that Arlene is one of many people involved in this project that's been at this forever and gotten major acclaim for all the work she's done over the years. And she's not just resting on laurels. That's why we come to this group. That's why we hope you'll come to it too. H, I'm going to hand it back to you for wrap, then we'll stop the recording, and anybody that wants to stay for an extra minute or two, we can do that. But what do you want us to walk away with today?
I want to make sure you all have our tribal broadband resource page. I share it often. Arlene, if you want to send me that, I can make sure that it gets on our page under sort of
Okay.
the digital inclusion section and best practices.
Okay, so they'll just get your they'll Paul or Stephanie or somebody will give me your email or forward it and copy me so we have an email connection.
Yeah, awesome. So I want to make sure.
I see your chat. Okay.
Yeah, so this is our resource page where you can follow all of the latest research from us. You know, we also have a blog and a Twitter. I think we even have an Instagram. There was a lot of talk about Instagram, National Congress of American Indians. But I just want to make sure that you all have these resources in order to be able to share them and talk about them and learn more. That's one of the biggest things is like, you know, doing a lot of like self-education to make sure that you are sharing the best, most useful resources.